Thank you. Now, also, there will not be a Q&A session as part of this briefing, but we will go through some steps for you to submit questions through the Procurement Central platform. So I'll go through those steps a little bit later in this presentation. Now, to begin with, we'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we join this call from today. For me, that is Kaurna country in South Australia. We recognize and pay our respects to those who have been the custodians of this land for countless generations, and we honor their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend our gratitude for their stewardship of this land throughout the ages. As we meet and share ideas, may we remember that the stories, traditions, and heritage are integral to the Australian identity, and let us approach our discussions today with mindfulness and respect for this land's rich history and diversity. Today, we're going to hear from a few people. Sarah Bradfield, the program lead from Core and Cluster Program, will talk to us next. Then we'll move on to Warren Yates, who is the Manager of Property and Assets in the Core and Cluster team. Megan Lawrence will be joining us from ACHIA as the Director of Project Development and Implementation to talk about the Coolum project. And Tranquility Clinton will be discussing property matters, and she's from RSM Australia. And I am Connor Wilson, Transaction Manager from the APP Group. I am assisting the department with running the transaction, but I'll also be facilitating this briefing session this morning. A couple extra points on this slide. There is a closing date for questions on Procurement Central of Monday, the 17th of January. Again, I'll go into a little bit more detail about the how and when a little bit later in this. And a recording and transcript of the session will be made available on the DCJ Core and Cluster webpage, but I believe a copy of the video pops up in this chat after we complete it as well, so you should have access to that then. So as I mentioned, I'll be handing over to Sarah very shortly to talk about the Core and Cluster program, a bit of a refresher on priorities and that sort of thing. We'll then be handing over to Warren Yates to discuss development approval considerations and a couple learnings from the EOI and previous tranches. Megan Lawrence will talk about the Coolum project and her work at ACHIA, and the Core and Cluster Property section will be handled by Tranquility Clinton, and then I will take over again to discuss the procurement process overview, go through some frequently asked questions, a little bit of high-level feedback on proposals, and then summarize and wrap up and potentially give you a couple minutes back in your morning for a coffee. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Sarah, Program Lead of Core and Cluster, to elaborate on the program and the priorities of Tranche 3. Sarah.
Thank you, Connor, and welcome everybody. It's great to have you all here for the Tranche 3.2 RFT industry briefing session, and wonderful that you've all come through to this stage. So that's really exciting. I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Gamilaroi people, where I'm lucky enough to live and to work, and I'd also like to pay my very deep and abiding respects to Aboriginal elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all of the colleagues that we have on the call today. Thank you so much. So we'll go on to the next slide, if that's possible, Connor. So as you all are aware, the Core and Cluster is the single biggest investment in addressing domestic and family violence in New South Wales history. 426.6 million. I think we might have jumped a slide, Connor. Might need to, oh no, there we go, we're right. Okay. Sorry everybody, jumping around a bit. Okay. So on the 19th of October, the government announced this historic investment of 484.3 million for housing and specialist supports for women and children experiencing domestic and family violence. As I said, it's the single biggest investment in DFE in the state's history, and the funding will provide 426.6 million over 4 years to expand the Core and Cluster and to deliver and operate new women's refuges that will support up to an additional 2,900 women and children escaping domestic and family violence every year. Core and Cluster, as you know, is an innovative crisis accommodation model that moves away from the shared house environment to a fully independent living quarters with private bathrooms and kitchen facilities. It combines services and supports of the traditional refuge with the independent living facilities of the transitional accommodation. Under the Core, there are communal facilities which provide access to services like counselling, legal services, education, employment support and conferencing. And under the Cluster, that's the self-contained accommodation units that are located close to the communal facilities. There's more information on the DCJ Core and Cluster webpage that you should familiarise yourself with around the investment, the procurement process, and some more supporting information like FAQs. So as you'll be aware, we've got procurement over 3 tranches targeted for Aboriginal-led providers, which is our 3.2 tranche, and our general process, which is 3.1 for all eligible organisations. Next slide, thanks, Connor. So the EOI phase for Tranche 3 is now concluded, and we're just starting on the RFT phase. So for Tranches 3.1 and 3.2, we're seeking projects that can commence from August 2024 and can be operationalised by early 2025. Projects that can be delivered after early 2025 will be considered by exception by the Tender Evaluation Committee, and priority will be given to Aboriginal-led applications and applications in areas of high and unmet needs. And just a reminder about the EOI debriefs. So specifically for Aboriginal-led applicants, we are offering the opportunity for an individual feedback session with DCJ, and we will provide you with feedback in that session about the Tender Evaluation Committee's review of your proposal. We really strongly encourage you to take up this opportunity to attend the session. It'll help you to apply that feedback to your RFT submission and create the strongest submission that you can for the RFT stage. So we'd be really open to hearing from you if you'd like to book in a session with us. I know we've reached out to you before, but please reach out to us through the Core and Cluster email inbox, and we can arrange those debrief sessions as we've previously offered for the Aboriginal applicants in 3.2. Okay, next slide. Thanks, Connor. So Aboriginal community controlled organisation led delivery under the Closing the Gap initiative, DCJ is one of the lead agencies responsible to expand the Aboriginal community controlled sector in various human services, including housing and homelessness. This aligns to DCJ's strategic priority to improve outcomes for Aboriginal people and communities across New South Wales. And DCJ is working internally to improve staff capability in engagement with Aboriginal markets and procurement from Aboriginal providers as our first step to expanding the sector. We're continually working to make the department a more attractive partner to Aboriginal organisations in contracting and service delivery. So it's not surprising to see that our key objectives for Tranche 3 procurement are to increase the number of Aboriginal-led projects that we're able to fund, as well as to address the issues of geographical imbalance in the spread of the refuges we've got across New South Wales, to identify projects that can commence from August 2024 onwards. So project locations, applications for the EOI phase were accepted from all areas of New South Wales and are going to be targeted to areas of high unmet need for crisis accommodation. There is a strong focus on regional and rural areas to ensure women escaping domestic and family violence can access the services that they need. And just a reminder that if you're proposing a development on LAC land, that community housing providers are required to gain in-principle support from the Land and Housing Corporation if they're making applications through the funding program for a development on LAC-owned land. Please contact the LAC email address there if you need to, if this applies to your project. Next slide, thanks, Connor. We're excited to also promote to you the opportunity around the Safe Places Emergency Accommodation Program, which is the Commonwealth-funded capital program. Safe Places is a capital works program funding the building and renovation or purchase of the emergency accommodation for women and children experiencing family and domestic violence. The Australian Government is investing $72.6 million in the Safe Places program as part of the 2022-2023 October budget, and has committed an additional $100 million over 5 years to continue the program via the Safe Places Inclusion Round. The Inclusion Round is open for applications until the 14th of November, so it's open now, and we'd really strongly encourage you to visit the Grant Connect website to find out more about that application and submit an application. We're encouraging our applicants to consider seeking funding from both Safe Places Emergency Accommodation Program and the Core and Cluster Program. We're working closely with DSS, so we will we will know if you've been successful with your Safe Places Emergency Accommodation Program application as it closes before our core and cluster program, and we will consider that when we're looking at the value for money aspect of our decision making. So we'd really strongly encourage you to have a look at that. It's absolutely fine to be applying for both for the same project to both Safe Places and core and cluster, and DSS and DCJ would welcome that. And yeah, as I said, visit the Grant Connect website to find more details and to submit your application. I also want to highlight another feature, which is a new feature for Tranche 3 that we haven't had in Tranche 1 or 2, which is the development of a project priority pipeline. So while the funding for the core and cluster is at a historic level of investment, it is finite. And as we work through this, I want to begin by understanding that the priority approved pipeline is a mechanism that we've designed to handle potential additional funding that may become available within the core and cluster program budget. This pipeline will provide a structured way to manage the funds and the opportunities. So the priority approved pipeline will comprise of respondents who have successfully met all eligibility criteria through the request for tender evaluation process, which is based on the Tranche 3 RFT priorities. It'll ensure that the organisations included in the pipeline are well aligned with our program objectives. It's not an indefinite arrangement. The priority approved pipeline will be valid for 12 months from the conclusion of the Tranche 3 RFT process, and the timeframe will allow us to make strategic decisions, within a reasonable horizon, accounting for potential changes in the program landscape. So it's essential to note that after this 12-month period, a new procurement process would need to be initiated if we have additional funds. This new process would be necessary to determine and select future projects for the core and cluster program. So the priority approved pipeline isn't a guarantee of future contracts, but it serves as a dynamic tool to support efficient resource allocation and to make the most of the excellent applications that we're expecting to receive through Tranche 3. So lastly, the priority approved pipeline is crucial for our procurement strategy, and it will be used to invite identified organisations to negotiate further for contracts related to the core and cluster program if the opportunity arises. It'll give us a streamlined and organised approach to engage with potential partners and ensures that we're working with entities to align our program's objectives and priorities. Next slide, thanks, Connor. These next two slides are just to answer some questions that have arisen and pretty much lessons learned actually through the process of tranches 1 and 2, and just a reminder around privacy. So of course, in development applications for refuges, it's really important that the location and the street address of that refuge remains private and confidential for the safety of women and children. So there are some steps that we've taken to support and encourage the maintenance of that data privacy. So we would suggest that when the core and cluster developers are working with town planning consultants, request to meet with the council's town planning and record management staff and the DPE if it's a regionally significant planning panel. And ensure that they know what the development is for and ensure that they are reminded about the need to keep that location private and confidential. If the core and cluster developers are denied the opportunity to meet with local council or DPE, DCJ, contact DCJ and we can speak with the DPE PDU concierge team, and you can do that through the core and cluster website, but if it's through the procurement process, please do it through the portal and we'll see what we can do to support and connect you with the right people. Step 4 of this is that the core and cluster developers and town planning consultants can ensure that both the town planning staff and records management team in the attendance understand the sensitivity of the development and the need for privacy and discretion. So what that means is that there'll be no public or adjoining owner notification, and all DA property files will be clearly marked confidential, and the street addresses will not be revealed through the GIPA records requests. So it's really about us ensuring that privacy and confidentiality to maintain safety for women and children once the refuges are developed. Next slide, thanks, Connor. This next slide just steps you through a little bit more around that core and cluster data privacy issue and the steps that you might take pre-DA, through the DA submission and post-DA. So we really encourage that you take have some time to think about the data privacy, and when you're working with your developers and planning consultants and with your councils, that you're recording the fact that this is a confidential information, and that the details and location of the address need to be withheld and maintained in that confidential manner. Councils are well aware of this, and we've been working with DPE, as I said, to ensure that these processes are in place. And then after the DA submission and post-DA, there's some more dot points there around the developer to continue those open communications with the assessment authority during the DA process, and request in the DA submission to council that the street address and development description is redacted from any general public documentation that could be accessed under a GIPA document request. So with that, that brings me to the end of my section, and we're now on to the next section, which is the development approval considerations. And I'd like to introduce Warren Yates, who's the manager of our property and assets, to speak about development approval considerations and our learnings from the EOI phase. Thank you, Warren.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the land of the Camaragal people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Next slide, thanks, Connor. So I'm just going to run through some of the things around the development phase of the project, some of the lessons learned from the EOI as well, give you some resources, and then talk you through sort of some of the things that we'd like to see coming through as part of the RFT responses. So we are looking for organisations, community housing providers that have the capacity and capability to contract with the department and deliver a core and cluster refuge in accordance with the functional design briefs. That's the domestic violence crisis accommodation functional design brief. So delivery can essentially be through one of either two methods. So what we term as a refurbishment model, where existing assets on land are secured and used or upgraded to meet the core and cluster requirements, or a new build model where land is secured and new assets are proposed. In terms of, I guess the first part of that is securing a site. So in terms of securing a site or land, the CHP will need to secure the land through either using land that is existing, already owned by the community housing provider, purchasing land using the government funds and then developing on that land, or the third one is securing a long-term lease on land from a third party for a period of 15 years or greater. And that period of 15 years or greater really is where we start to have that term as a long-term approach. So one of the things that we do also need to consider is that the Department of Communities and Justice will be required to register its statutory interest on the land or the lease, and it will be the applicant's responsibility to ensure that this is possible. Next slide, thanks, Connor. So this is a little bit more around some of the learnings from the EOI process that we're starting to talk through now. So what we are looking for as we're reviewing tenders and as part of the RFT process is to see if the site you're proposing as part of your request for a tender response can be secured and can deliver a core and cluster model in a timely manner. So that's really what we're looking to see. So in terms of securing the site, if you don't already own a site or have a lease on a site, that is okay. We're not expecting respondents to have a binding contract with a vendor at this procurement stage. What we are looking for are other forms of agreement or intent to enter into agreement that give us an indication that you're on the pathway to securing a site. So examples of some of these agreements might be a heads of agreement, an option agreement, an exclusive dealing period that's been negotiated, or an intent to transact. What we're really looking for is engagement with a vendor, which gives us some evidence and comfort that you've taken the steps to mitigate the risk of securing the site. So that's really what we're looking for. In terms of developing a site, what we really are looking for is to see a site that is developable for a core and cluster model, and at the risk of not being able to develop it or not being able to develop it in a timely manner has been thought through by the respondent, and that risk has been mitigated to some extent. So at this stage, at the procurement stage, we're really looking at seeing some desktop due diligence from the respondent, confirming that the site isn't significantly constrained. So some of the common issues that we saw through the EOI process in terms of the physical constraints, the first two were flood and bushfire. So they were some of the, as I said, quite common in what we saw coming through. And then a lesser one that we did see coming through was some heritage constraints as well. The other impact that we do see that creates a significant risk to the developability of the site is the site zoning and identification of the planning approval pathway. What we want to see as part of the desktop assessment is what is that proposed planning approval pathway. So the functional design brief looks at consent through a permanent or a transitional group home. And that basically gives us three options for planning consent. The first option is development without consent. So that's for a core and cluster model up to 10 bedrooms in size. It's important to note that that's 10 bedrooms, not 10 units. And that's by a public authority. So essentially development without consent is really limited to land that is owned by the Landing Housing Corporation. The second option, which doesn't involve the local council, is a complying development certificate under the housing SEP. Once again, that is limited to sites that are up to 10 bedrooms in size. If we do go over 10 bedrooms in size, then we immediately fall through to the third option, which is development consent with council. So anything over 10 bedrooms must go through that council consent process. And that council consent process obviously starts to touch on that data privacy framework that Sarah just spoke to you about. So it's important to consider that planning approval pathway in that context. In assessing the responses, we are looking to see that these items have been considered and addressed and are also taken into consideration in developing your overall development program. Do you want to go on to the next slide, please, Connor? So the next slide is about some resources that are available to you as respondents to address some of those issues that we are looking for. So the first one, in terms of some of the information that is readily available to you, is the first one is the Section 10.7 planning certificate. So this provides basic planning and information on your proposed property. It includes information about the key constraints, heritage, bushfires, etc. They cost about $150 and can be purchased online or through the local council. These are recommended as they do contain the latest information on your property. Another resource that is available is the New South Wales Planning Portal Spatial Viewer, and I've given you the web link there. So basically it's an online portal that contains very similar information to your Section 10.7 certificate. However, it does have a nice summary of the key items that impact your relevant property. So if you type in the address, it will give you on the right hand side, it will show you what some of those key issues are. The only issue that we do need to see is occasionally the information on the Section 10.7 certificate and the Planning Portal Spatial Viewer doesn't align. And in that case, you probably just need to get some further advice on which one is more up to date. In terms of flood information, the keeper of flood information are the local councils. So once again, any discussions with local councils need to be in that data privacy framework that Sarah did mention earlier. So councils control the quality and quantity of information, and it is very much dependent on the individual councils. Some councils will have really detailed flood mapping information, and you can do all your searching online. Other councils have no flood mapping and no information and force you to essentially purchase what's called a flood certificate to provide you information on the site. So it is important that you do, if there are any questions, that you do go to council and speak to them if there are any concerns. One of the things to note about flood is that we're not necessarily just looking at direct flood impact. So we're also looking to see, councils will also want to see that there is no indirect impact. So if you've got a site that is not flood impacted, but you're in an area that is flood impacted, council will want to see that you can actually egress from the site in the event of a flood. And we actually had an example of this with a disability group home many years ago, the site wasn't flood impacted, but it effectively became an island in a flood, and we actually couldn't get egress off the site. So council actually did not allow us to develop the site. So that's actually a live example. If you are looking at a site that is flood impacted and are considering developing that site, you may need to get a consultant engineer involved. That can be costly, but they will give you some advice on whether you can develop that site further based on the planning approval use as a group home. Bushfire information. Bushfire information, the main source will be your Section 10.7 certificate or the New South Wales Planning Portal. Another source is the Rural Fire Service. So if you are looking at developing on a site that may be in a bushfire buffer zone, the Rural Fire Service will be a worthwhile resource. Bushfire consultants also can provide a cheap and inexpensive service that can provide some high-level advice on whether they think it is developable. So if you are looking at something that is impacted by bushfire, I would suggest those two resources be contacted. In terms of planning approval pathway, a resource for planning approval pathways, the functional design brief in section 2 has quite a lot of information on planning approval pathways, and the housing SEP is also very useful. One of the things though that we would suggest is that you do get a town planner involved who is familiar with these types of developments to review your proposed site. So not only will they cover all the site constraints, they will also look at what is the best planning approval pathway for your individual site. I think our recommendation would be get a planning consultant involved. It is normally for a relatively small fee that they will do that. It's really useful for us in reviewing sites that we get an understanding that you fully understand the risks on your proposed development site. All right, Connor, on to the next slide. In terms of designing, I think Connor will probably touch on this a little later, but we are looking to see how your proposal responds to the functional design brief. So in terms of your response, there are two ways which you can do this. The first way is providing a floor plan. It isn't a requirement, but it is something that is really helpful in terms of expressing your understanding of the functional design brief. They say a picture tells 1,000 words. In a floor plan, it probably tells us more than 1,000 words. So a floor plan, in terms of demonstrating your understanding of the functional design brief, is a really good tool. If you can't provide a floor plan, please provide a detailed description. And that should really include sort of how the spaces on the site work and how they respond to the functional design brief. So some of the key design issues that we will be looking at, firstly is the size of the proposal. So the functional design brief looks at an ideal size of around 6 units that supports 10 to 20 people. If it is larger than this, basically the response really needs to demonstrate how that proposal supports the functional design brief. Flexibility, that's another one of the key drivers in the functional design brief. So providing flexible spaces is important, and outlining how your response is flexible is really important. The functional design brief does highlight dual key access as a key tool, but we basically want to see how your proposal caters for potentially women and children of different sizes. Is it a single mother coming? Is it a mother with 3 or 4 children? So it's how does the model respond to that level of flexibility? And then the last one is spatial relationships. How does everything work together and how does everything fit on the site? How do the external areas interact with the internal areas is really important. Last slide, thanks, Connor. And this is my last slide. So in terms of actually developing the site, so the actual, I guess, design and construction process, some of the things that we're looking at is a really good team structure. We want to see, we want to get an understanding that you understand the development process, and a good team structure shows this, and also the organisation's capacity and capability. Can the organisation deliver in the area? And that also should extend to the asset management side of things as well. And lastly of all, it's not actually in my slide deck, but one thing that we really do want to see overall is a realistic program. So what we don't want to see is a program that it squishes everything into 6 months, and that it isn't realistic. So through the tender process, we'll actually do our own assessment of what we think the time frame is, and we want to see a proposal that roughly aligns that. And a key component to that is that planning approval pathway. So you need to have an understanding of that planning approval pathway to have a realistic time frame. And the reason being, if you're using the complying development pathway, then that planning approval pathway timeframe will be shorter than if you're using a council DA process. So can't stress enough that the realistic program is important. And that's probably it from me, Connor. I think I'm finished.
Thank you very much for that, Warren. Now, before I hand over to Megan, I just have noticed a question that's come from the chat. Just a quick reminder, we won't be able to answer questions in this session. That's just due to equity and fairness to people who weren't able to make it this morning or are in different streams. So I'll go through some steps of how you can submit questions through the Procurement Central platform, and we'll be able to get that question back to you if you go through that process. So thank you for the interest, and we'll go through that shortly. But now I'd like to introduce Megan Lawrence to speak about the Coolman project and assistance that's available for parties developing their RFT responses. Megan, over to you.
Thanks, Connor. So I'm Megan Lawrence. I'm the Director of Project Development and Implementation, and I'm joining you from beautiful Biripi country on the mid-north coast. I'd just like to acknowledge that this joined from Aboriginal land, as we all are across the state and across the country, and it always has been and always will be Aboriginal land. So ACHIA is the Aboriginal Community Housing Industry Association. So we're the peak body in New South Wales for Aboriginal community controlled housing providers. But in the case of Core and Cluster, as I'm going to talk about, we're supporting all ACOs. So this is around capacity and capability for all ACOs who are developing tenders and then ultimately leading services in the Aboriginal-led stream. This project is funded by DCJ and it's really around supporting the success of the development of these Aboriginal-led services. On the next slide, so as I say, actually we're a community controlled organisation ourselves and we're a peak body. And while our core business is supporting Aboriginal community housing providers, we are supporting all ACOs in Core and Cluster. So it doesn't matter whether you're an AMS or already an established specialist homes service or a community service, whatever stripe you are of an ACO, we're here to support you. And that, as I say, is through both the procurement stages as well as through service establishment. As you would have heard, we were talking about the Coolman project. So this fits into a range of capability and capacity support that we provide as part of our core business. And the Coolman project has been so named because the utility of the Coolman and the variety of ways that the Coolman has been used. And hopefully our vision for our project is that we also can bring supports that fit and align with the needs of ACOs in the core and cluster space. We work together with our partner peaks, Homelessness New South Wales and Domestic Violence New South Wales wherever possible, and we work quite closely with them, and it's been a really good and valuable space. So, you know, it's not just connecting with us, but connecting with the other peaks that might be able to support you. Our work is led by the very capable Eleanor McCall, who is a Gamilaroi woman and has experience in the delivery and the leadership of frontline DFV services, leading an Aboriginal refuge. She's also worked in family preservation, health and health promotion. So she's your go-to lady, and she's fantastic and she's warm, and I hope many of you have already had the chance to at least meet her on the phone. And her details are there for your future reference. So as on the next slide, we talk around the importance of Aboriginal-led services, and Sarah spoke of this a little bit in terms of closing the gap. So we know that the rate of reported domestic violence related assault for Aboriginal women is 4 times that in New South Wales and the whole female population. And so therefore the provision of culturally safe services is absolutely essential. I expect many of you are familiar with the map that's on the slide, but essentially there have been 5 services funded to date through Core and Cluster that are Aboriginal-led services. And our end game is how do we create the maximum number of strong and effective services for Aboriginal women and children that we're meeting that need. So closing the gap talks around the critical role of ACOs in delivering these services. And when I was talking to a colleague around Core and Cluster and what it is, she summed up beautifully when she spoke it back to me. She said, well, this is about safety. And that's what it's about. It's about safety and strong services. So while there might have been steps where we were wanting to engage ACOs, or we want to support you in terms of your preparation of your EOI or your tender writing, the end game of all of these steps is strong services led by ACOs for providing safety and services for their communities. So what type of support's available? There is expert advice around a range of different areas. So there is support available for you right now in terms of tender writing and tender review. So we have a set of expert tender support consultants, and we are able to fund you up to, all ACOs are able to get funding of up to 36 hours of tender writing support. So that might be around the preparing of your tender, or you might ask someone to review the tender. Reach out to us and we can connect you with those services. Also providing a workshop around tender writing and service development, as well as regular updates when things are moving in this space and things are changing. Then make sure you're on our distribution list for that, so that we can keep you updated on the support that's available, as well as the landscape in terms of the developments and things that are happening there. We're really keen that we can help share stories and knowledge to embed best practice, and that we can, as I say, support that end goal of strong services, as well as one-on-one assistance that's available. One of the other pieces that we've been looking at is around service design, and a reflection from Mary Moran, who was Eleanor's predecessor, was when she was looking at the safety wheel, she felt that there were considerations that Aboriginal women, when they're considering leaving violence, were not being addressed in the safety wheel. So this really highlighted a gap for us in terms of how are the resources and the supports for services that are developing DFV support for Aboriginal women and children. And we saw this gap, and from that has been the development of these resources, My Path, My Steps, and the mirror resource services, Your Path, Your Steps. These resources are around how do we shift the power and empower women who are in a situation of violence to consider their choices within a framework that reflects well and is a comfortable fit for Aboriginal culture. So it's specifically designed for services supporting Aboriginal women and women who are leaving or considering leaving violence. These are currently hard copy, but we're working on an electronic resource as well. Reach out to Eleanor and she's able to send you out some samples. It might be good food for thought in terms of when you're thinking about your tender and how your service is going to look. We hope that these are valuable resources. So please know that they're out there and they've been developed for you. On the next slide, we talk about some of the things that are upcoming. And so we're developing a community of practice. We've got some webinars and resources that will be coming online around different topics, such as finance and budgets, communication, legal considerations in this service space, as well as other resources around workforce and work health and safety, and architecture and design resources. I hope that you're all well familiar with the suite of resources that are on the next slide, which are those that have been developed in partnership with our partner peaks, with Homelessness New South Wales and Domestic Violence New South Wales. There is a treasure trove of resources out there, including some pieces around the planning support that echo some of the advice that Warren was given, and would complement that. So there's a partnerships toolkit to think about how you are going to, what are the different arrangements that you might put in place for any partnerships that you're entering into. Planning and design, as I spoke to, as well as some really important DFV resources around best practice, films and animation that talk to child-centered practice, trauma-informed practice, what these things look like, and a DFV specialisation checklist. So there's a lot of resources out there already, and we're all ears if there are gaps and pieces of other tools and resources that might help. But please check out these websites as really valuable food for thought and guidance documents as you progress with preparing your tender and hopefully your service design after you've been notified you've been successful. So the message from our end is that you're not alone. There is a warm and welcoming network of support that DCJ has generously funded. Please use us, because we want to be able to walk shoulder to shoulder with you, and we're very keen to respond to requests of things that are of priority to you, both now as you're in the procurement phase And on the other side, when you're in the service development phase, and I know some of you are on both sides of the fence in terms of participating in procurement, but also having been successful in tranche 1 or 2. We're here as a resource. Please use us, and we want to be able to. So the last slide just has the contact details for both Eleanor and myself. Reach out, and we wish you all the best and look forward to walking this journey with you.
Wonderful. Megan, thank you very much for your time and for speaking to the group. Now, before I go through the procurement process, I'd like to introduce Tranquility Clinton, Associate Director at RSM, to discuss probity protocols for the Core and Cluster program. Good morning, Tranquility.
Thanks, Connor, and morning all. I'm Tranquility from RSM Australia, and we've been engaged as the independent probity advisor to oversee this process. Our role is to monitor, advise, and report on the process, ensure that it's conducted in accordance with the key probity principles, and importantly, that all respondents have been treated fairly and equally. We recognise that significant time and effort has been and will be invested in your participation in this process. So we want to make sure that all respondents have confidence in the process and that there's defensibility in the outcome. Whilst we've been working with the project team to ensure that the state's obligations are met, there are a number of requirements that I wanted to make sure that you're aware of. Participants that have pre-existing relationships with DCJ should not be discussing the RFP process with any of those contacts. There should be no unauthorised communication with DCJ or its advisors regarding the process. Similarly, you should not be seeking to obtain an unfair advantage or improper assistance or lobby government or its officials. There have been formal avenues that have been established for clarification questions and resources that you can engage to support you in preparation for your tender. Cannot stress this enough, but please make sure that you read and understand the RFT terms, conditions, and the specification. This includes the evaluation criteria and the information that you've been requested to submit as part of your response. Make sure that you put your best foot forward. So don't leave any room for assumptions in your submission. Part of my role will be overseeing the evaluation process, and it's making sure that you are evaluated on the information that you've put forward. So please do reach out if you have any questions. And finally, my details have been provided in these slides. Please do reach out if you have any probity concerns or queries. Thanks for that, Connor. Back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Now, I'm going to go through the procurement process for Tranche 3 of the Core and Cluster program in a high level, including some key dates, the approach to evaluation, and the evaluation criteria itself. Now, within the Tranche 3 procurement, there are two concurrent processes being run. There's a broad stream that is open to everyone and a stream targeted at Aboriginal-led responses. The evaluation for the request for tender takes place across 4 general phases, with a few more internal cycles, to be fair. There's a conformance and completeness check, which is where the team reviews mandatory information has been provided and eligibility criteria has been met before passing on to tender evaluation committees. So that evaluation assessment is undertaken by district tender evaluation committees, or TECs as they're referred to, and the TECs will review the qualitative aspects of responses before considering pricing information. Once that initial evaluation has been done, the TECs then perform a comparative assessment and a value for money assessment of that pricing components, as well as a couple other sort of key features. The result is an overall ranking of the submissions. From there, the steering committee will review. They'll form a slightly more holistic review of the district TEC recommendations, but also look to validate their scores and double check that they're prioritizing state goals. During the evaluation phase, the TECs will score responses against qualitative criteria on the slide out of 10. So that would be all of the 10 criteria there on the left-hand side of the screen. Each organization will then be ranked according to their final score, and the TECs will then undergo that comparative value for money assessment using the points on the right-hand side of that screen to provide an overall ranking. It's at that stage that the project steering committee will review all the scoring and ensure that projects align with state priorities and endorse the project recommendations for contract award. Now, in terms of submitting the RFT, please ensure that your contact details in the Procurement Central platform are up to date and that any nominated contacts are included. This is the platform that we'll use to communicate with you and upload documents, and it's important that you keep it up to date. The second point here talks about response envelopes. Please note that there's a technical envelope and a qualification envelope, both of which must be completed. And the third point on the screen lists a couple of key documents that I urge you become familiar with if you haven't done so already. There are hyperlinks to these documents in the RFT introduction document, but they're also available for download via the Attachments tab in Procurement Central. Now, also a slightly more general note, a lot of these slides do have hyperlinks in them with the documents or email addresses. All of these slides will be available to you in the Attachments tab of Procurement Central as well. So you're more than welcome to log in, check that your details are up to date after this presentation, and download some additional information. Applicants in Tranche 3.2 also have the option to present their projects in a narrative format to the tech once the RFT is closed. Please note that the RFT introduction document requests that respondents highlight the preference in the qualification envelope on Procurement Central portal. So if I could just ask you to mute your microphones. There we go. However, please note that this is actually incorrect, and corrected instructions will be issued shortly. But what we'd ask is that you email the core and cluster email address if you'd like to include yourself in that narrative format. Please note carefully that opting to present this project in a narrative session does not mean that a submission does not need to be made via the Procurement Central platform. We still need core information about the project submitted through Procurement Central by the RFT closing deadline in order to assess your project and your response. Now, onto that section around submitting a question. Questions about the tender must be submitted through the Procurement Central platform via the message board, and I'll show you a couple little workflows for that in a second. Responses will be provided via an addendum for transparency's sake. So that means that the responses to questions will be available for everyone to see. Email notifications will be provided to registered email addresses once those addendums are published, and that's why it's so key to have your contact details up to date. If your organization has had multiple projects advance from EOI through the RFT, please follow the instructions set out in section 2.16 of the response envelope. There's no need to submit a separate RFT for each site. It'll save you work in not doing so, and it saves us work on the evaluation side as well. There is an icon on the bottom left hand of that slide. Once you start progressing through your application, that will turn into a paperclip that will signify that you can download a document through that field. In this case, it is the supplier response form that you need to populate for an additional site. So on this one, it's just a quick note to let you know that the way that you are uploading information has changed slightly from the EOI process. So instead of having a zip file that you have all of your attachments in, the core and cluster procurement team have facilitated essentially a drop field or a browse upload system for you to upload documents against specific criteria for your site. So there'll still be that supplier response form that you need to download, populate, and attach. But in terms of uploading your supporting documentation, it's a slightly different methodology that's screenshot here. Now, the department welcomes joint responses. However, if you are submitting a joint response on behalf of a joint venture, partnership, or as a consortium, the department will only consider a single response from the lead legal entity of a joint venture, partnership, or a consortium's lead agency. And please note that consortia must be established as a duly constituted legal entity. The next few slides will set out some key dates and details for your records. These are also in your RFT document pack. Please note the RFX details in the middle of the page. This is for this Tranche 3.2, the Aboriginal-led tranche. The RFX code is RFX_911. The RFT closing time and date are 11 a.m. Eastern Time on the 31st of January 2024. And please note that you can save as you go and come back to your submission. So please do not leave uploading everything and submitting to the last minute. Submissions will take you a little while, and the day that you leave pressing send to the last minute is the day that the upload will fail, the internet will drop out, the power will shut off, whatever last minute catastrophe could happen. It can just be avoided by submitting a little bit early and being a bit organized. On that note, late tender submissions will be marked as a late response by the system automatically, and it will be up to the text team's discretion to evaluate those responses. As previously mentioned, questions regarding the RFT need to go through Procurement Central, but questions or concerns about probity or the process should be directed to Tranquility or Sarah Bradfield during the via the contact details on screen. There are also some contact details here in the event that you need technical support and an escalation point if you're not getting resolution. Now, this is a bit of a how-to. So at the top, you will see addendums on Procurement Central by going to the Messages tab and looking at new messages. Conversely, if you want to send a message, including questions, you can send those by going to the Messages tab and create messages. So if you do have a question that comes from the session or about the RFT in general, please send questions through that process. Now, quickly onto the core and cluster proposals. You may very well recall seeing this slide before during the EOI stage, and I raised this here and a few of the next slides to be fair to reiterate the goal of the project and what you should be focused on addressing. So please give due weight and attention to each of the 4 components on screen. There's land provision, asset delivery, service delivery, and asset maintenance. All should be detailed in your responses. So please make sure that you really sort of look at each one of those and revisit the slide as you progress with your application. This slide details the asset design considerations, and there are a number of elements that go into a good design for core and cluster project. And I would urge you to revisit the slide at various stages of developing your response to make sure that you're still addressing considerations on this slide. Make sure that you have that flexibility and that dual key features that Warren was talking to. Does your response capture adequate office space and therapy and counseling rooms and general amenities? Do you have safety and security as one of your sort of paramount considerations? And do you have child-focused spaces? Those sort of things. So this slide really sort of starts to break down and give a real sort of bullet point view of those considerations. And I think it's a helpful tool to come back to. This slide is really to serve as a reminder of the priority clientele. So Aboriginal women are identified as a priority target client group, but services are generally targeted to women with or without children who are experiencing or at high risk of homelessness due to domestic and family violence. And services delivered through core and cluster must be fully accessible to women based on diverse backgrounds and needs based on Aboriginality, age, culture, or linguistic background, disability, mental health, and sexual orientation and caring responsibilities. Now, as mentioned by Sarah, Tranche 3 of the core and cluster is targeting projects that can commence from August 2024 and be operationalized by early 2025. That means in the first half of 2025. We do appreciate that this is a tight timeframe for some projects, especially for new builds, and it is incredibly important that this timeline and program for your project is carefully thought through and that you consider project interdependencies. We want to see realistic timeframes being put forward. Now, projects that cannot be completed in this timeframe can still be contemplated by the tech, but it is at their discretion, so it's not a guarantee that it'll be considered. Now, in regard to the completeness of your response, the department can only consider each response based on its own merit if it's not provided on time and in writing and supported where relevant, and noting the exception of responses via the narrative session. Otherwise, if it's not provided, it can't be considered and evaluated as part of the proposal. So please make sure your responses include all the required documents, read the conditions of tendering, and double check your work, or get somebody else in your team to get fresh eyes over the submission before submitting. This slide provides details of the contracting arrangements. There'll be 2 contractual agreements, a Community Housing Assistance Agreement, or a CHA, regarding the capital ownership and leasing, and Human Services Agreements, or an HSA, for service delivery. Now, most of you will be familiar with these contracts, but please consider them in light of the project you are submitting, and note that the final point on the screen, which is applicants who seek to materially depart from the standard or common terms at any stage of the procurement process may be disqualified as a non-conforming tenderer. The next slide is going to provide a hyperlink for frequently asked questions. This has been developed over the most recent EOI phase as well as previous tranches. So there's a wealth of information in the document, and I strongly encourage you to read through, even if you don't have a set question in mind. It might give you a rounder knowledge of the project, or it might prompt a question for you. Now, the good news, this is the last section of the briefing. We're going to go through key points of this presentation, so please bear with me for a couple more minutes. Now, the who should be self-evident. It's the organizations that have advanced through the Tranche 3 EOI phase, so the majority of people on this call. The what are projects to establish the core and cluster refuge facilities that can commence from August 2024, with priority given to Aboriginal-led projects in areas of high need and areas where there are known service gap deliveries for women refugees. Proposals must be submitted through Procurement Central platform, so that means that we're not accepting them via email or in hard copy. And the when, Tranche 3 RFT close date is at 11 a.m. Eastern time on Wednesday, 31st of January. And the why is to expand on that delivery and operation of new women's refuges that will support an additional 2,900 women and children escaping domestic and family violence each year. The how, we've got those response envelopes, both the technical and qualification in the Procurement Central portal must be completed and submitted by the RFT close date and meet eligibility criteria set out in that RFT introduction document. So that wraps up the respondent briefing session from today. Thank you all very much for your time this morning and for joining us. Please have a great and wonderful day. Thank you.
Hey, Connor.
Hey, Samina. All right, so it looks like everybody else is out.
Yep.
Had to remove a couple people just at the end who probably popped off to get a coffee or something halfway through.
Thanks.
So a couple questions come through. I think I answered them sort of going through it predominantly, to be honest, except for the impact of Christmas and New Year's close down, because I think that's probably just a slightly antagonistic question than anything else. But beyond that, I think that was okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, well, it's been really clear in RFT documentation, introduction document, in terms of the timelines and timeframes and communication, how it's going to happen. So it's just a matter of them now. All good. So do you mind sending me the PDF version again? Because then I can send it to Eliza and she can upload it on the industry, on the Procurement Central. And we'll also make the recordings available as well later on. So, So just one last thing, Connor, on a different note, tender evaluation plan. Now that we've got the industry briefing out, I don't know whether you're probably still busy with the debriefing stuff as well at the same time. But can you please keep that in your mind as well? Because,
Yeah, absolutely. So the plan with that, I've got a meeting on Thursday morning with
good.
With Sarah and Blaine. We wanted to sort of go through that evaluation methodology just to make sure we're all on the same page before locking it in. But my goal this week is to continue to advance that tender evaluation plan and that evaluation methodology so I can present it on Thursday, get in principle support, and then deliver you something by the end of the week to consider.
Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate all your help. Now, thank you so much. Yeah, that's
No
all.
worries.
So that's it from me, and you have a nice day. And thank you very much for working so hard.
Pleasure. I will see you all soon, I'm sure.
No worries. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.